Hi, everyone. I'm here with Michael Yudin, who was a senior leader at the U.S. Department of Education under President Obama. He led the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. And I was told that you also worked in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. Is that true?
That is true. I did. I did it for 2 years there. Yeah, I actually was the deputy there. So I helped lead that office. Yeah.
Amazing. And he is here to help us understand better what is going on right now. And I will just say for me, it is so lovely to have an actual expert here because we have been dealing with some serious incompetence in the Department of Education. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for doing this, right? There's a lot going on and people need to understand and know what's happening.
Absolutely. And we're hearing the administration say we don't need the Department of Education, but they're also transferring a lot of its functions to other agencies. So that's a contradiction. And what does that tell you?
It tells me a couple of things. It tells me one is that, they are making political decisions that really aren't looking at what the impact of this is on kids, right? How does this impact kids? They are making political decisions following the president's order to. So it's a little contradictory, right? Because what you have is you have this effort to return education to the states. And you can agree or not on what is the appropriate role of the federal government in education, right? You can agree on policy. What is the appropriate role? But so their position is Secretary McMahon's position is to return education to the states, not to the Department of Labor, not to the Department of Health and Human Services, not scattered across the federal government. It is just bureaucracy. It is just adding more bureaucracy. It's not achieving the goals. I don't agree with that goal of returning education to the states. I think there is a critical role for the federal government to play. But that's Washington, that's politics. You have an administration that, moves forward on its policy priorities. Every administration does, right? But doing these moves that the department just announced, I do not see at all how that actually furthers their goal of returning education to the states. And I'll say it 100 times today, right? Like, I don't know how this is good for kids. At the end of the day, this advances a political agenda and not necessarily a policy goal. What is good in the best interest of kids?
And for all this talk about returning education to the states, I'm here in California and we're seeing a lot of federal attacks and a lot of people saying you can't have this funding if you do X, Y, or Z. But it's the states that are doing things. So if we're really returning education to the states, why are we policing what the states do?
You're not really asking me a question there, are you? Right? That's a
I just sometimes like to have an expert say that I'm not crazy because sometimes I
You
feel
are not
crazy. This
you are not
administration is like,
crazy. You are not crazy. I mean, look, there are contradictions all over the place. Whether, the state wants to move forward with how it supports transgender youth, right? And this administration is saying, no, you can't do that. So that's a perfect example of that contradiction.
we're seeing them scatter things into different agencies. You mentioned that we have a federal role in education for a reason. What is the impact going to be with them taking programs and grants out of a specialized agency and putting them in other agencies that are not specialized?
Yeah, I mean, Ariel, the role of the federal government is critically important, right? Federal education laws came about mostly in the 60s, right? States and school districts were not providing equal opportunity to education, right? It followed Brown versus Board of Education and the move to end segregation. States and districts around the country weren't doing a particularly good job of doing that. They weren't really meeting the needs of poor kids, kids of color, kids with disabilities, English learners, and so Congress created a federal role. That role is the backstop, right, for ensuring that all of our kids have equal opportunity in education, that we can remove barriers that are in place and actually make sure kids get the services they need ultimately to be successful. as a result of that's the role of the federal government. So the US Department of Education is there to ensure that that happens, right? So they do that in myriad ways. They obviously, provide funding to states and school districts in accordance with the law, but they provide technical assistance, they provide support, they collect data, they report trends, they support research, share best practices, provide oversight and enforcement, ensuring compliance with the law, both from a civil rights perspective and ensuring that states and school districts are actually carrying out the law as Congress intended.
Yes, and I mean, one concern that a lot of people are having is the Department of Education has a pretty significant role in protecting students with disabilities and making sure they get the education they're entitled to. But, with IDEA, while it's technically still law, there's a lot of people like me too, justifiably concerned that with all these layoffs and transfers that there might be a world in which IDEA is weakened or not enforced or overseen at the federal level. Is there should that be a concern, or what are you thinking with that?
Oh, I am very concerned, and it should be a concern. And whether you have a kid with a disability, or you have a brother with a kid with a disability, or a neighbor, or an aunt, or an uncle, or whatever, right? Like this is a very real concern, right? And this isn't just isolated to like the most recent actions, right? We have seen, since the president's executive order, we have seen hundreds of millions of dollars in grants canceled that support teachers in providing services to kids. We saw the firing of all the civil rights, or not all, but many of the civil rights attorneys. Many of our civil rights complaints and investigations revolve around special ed and kids with disabilities. So the Office for Civil Rights is clearly impacted in their ability to do that. Um, and then of course, in addition, is the most recent round of firings. Now that has been put on hold by a court, and then Congress kind of reversed it. But they fired the, practically the entire Office of Special Ed and Rehab Services, right? Um, in God's name, are we going to provide technical assistance, support, and oversight and enforcement to make sure that our kids are getting the services they need? And this is across the department, but for me, and I ran the Office of Special Ed. I know the value of those people. I know the work that they do. They are brilliant, dedicated public servants who are here to make sure that kids with disabilities get the services they're entitled to. My real concern is that all of these actions, right, will just make it harder for kids to get the services that they are entitled to under the law. And the burden is going to shift to parents and teachers, right? Who's going to have to carry this, right? If the federal government does not have any meaningful role in ensuring kids get the services they need, it's going to be harder to get the services, and the burden is going to fall to parents.
When they say things are going back to the states, there are just states that do not care at the level they are supposed to about protecting our most vulnerable students. And that's what's very concerning to me, that this political theater is going to I, it's going to impact students. And that's when I talk to these employees who were riffed or fired, they're saying, like, forget the job. We're concerned. These kids are, at risk here. It's very, very frightening.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Ariel. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Like this is a 5 alarm fire, right? If it just is, there's no question about it.
Secretary McMahon had her first all staff meeting. What was it, the other day? I got the transcript for it, and she just makes it abundantly clear that there is not a plan for what will happen after these things are moved out of the Department of Education, further than we're going to close it, which seems so crazy to me because they're keeping things that they're supposed to keep and moving them to different departments so they don't work.
Well, and without congressional approval,
Right,
right?
exactly. And I'm wondering, is there a world in which we could see lawsuits about this? Because while they are not technically, quote unquote, dismantling the department, even though we know that they are, is there a way that the courts could step in and be like, yeah, you say that you're not doing this, but functionally you are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I don't have the expertise in litigation strategy, right? So I'm reluctant to weigh in there, but I can tell you, right, if we, and I am a lawyer, but but I don't litigate. So I don't want to just overstep, get ahead of my skis, as they say. But, if you look at the statute IDEA, it is very, very clear that Congress established, requires, mandates that the special ed programs under IDEA, the programs under IDEA be administered by the Office of Special Ed Programs, right? It is the plain reading of this statute. And that's the case with other federal programs as well, right? Congress made it very clear who has to administer the law. How courts, will ultimately interpret the set of actions that this administration is doing. Is it a circumvention of law? Is it meeting the letter of the law? I don't know. But what I can tell you is I am certain there's already litigation around some of the RIFs and the executive order. And so I fully expect those efforts will now incorporate the most recent actions. There probably will be new efforts in litigation. And it's an incredibly important avenue, right? We have three branches of government. One is doing what it's doing, right? It's taking these unilateral actions to dismantle a cabinet level agency, frankly, that Congress created because education was fragmented and scattered across the government. And now again, right, it will be. We have one branch of a government that's taking these unilateral actions. You have two other branches of government. You have Congress and the courts, and one or both of those branches have to step in here.
A lot of people ask me, what can we do? Is there anything we can do to protect our students? Teachers are asking how they can protect themselves in their schools. Do you have anything further than the court stepping in? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, Congress has a role to play here too, right? They wrote the law. They should enforce the law. They have tools in their tool belt, right? We are, on the verge of we just resolved, after a 43-day government shutdown, over funding issues and appropriations and the like. Congress has to appropriate money for the federal government by January 30th. They have to, and particularly for education programs, right? By January 30th. They can very clearly say, you know what? The Department of Education is prohibited from using funds to carry out these actions, to execute against these agreements. They can do that, and that literally will stop it, right? So what can parents do? Parents can do a lot, right? Like, members of Congress listen to their constituents. They do. They do, right? That's their job. That's why they're here. And so parents and teachers can speak up. Social media, write letter to the editor, your local newspapers, right? Members of Congress read their local papers. For me, what would be incredibly valuable is to see parents say, this is the impact of these decisions on the services my kids get. I have to spend all this effort and energy to make sure that my kids' IEP goals and services are in place. And then we have to make sure that they're getting them. And it's a hard job. It's a hard job to be a parent, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, this is going to make it harder.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you said that. I think I was a little skeptical, but I have literally heard members of Congress mentioning, like, remember that person's story? We read this on the
That's
floor. Like,
exactly right.
if you get your story in front of them, they do think of you.
Absolutely. 100%. 100%.
Is there anything else that you want to touch on or any misconceptions you want to clear up or anything like that?
The only other thing I do want to say, though, is particularly in IDEA and special ed, and because that's kind of fundamentally different from other federal education programs, right? IDEA at its heart is a civil rights statute, right? It is based on court decisions that interpreted the Brown versus Board of Education. Separate but equal is inherently unequal, and that applies to kids with disabilities. When I was a kid growing up, I'm well into my 60s now. When I was a kid growing up, I didn't go to school with kids with disabilities. But they weren't there. Right, I didn't know kids with disabilities because they didn't go to my schools or they weren't in my classes, right? They were bussed out, shipped out, and there were laws on the books in states across the country that you didn't even have to educate kids if you determined they were uneducable. And that's, in my lifetime, that's not 100 years ago. That's, a few decades, 3 or 4 decades ago, right? 5 decades ago, right? Because IDA is now 50 years old, right? But all that to say, right, this is really at its heart is about equal opportunity. And again, because IDA is a civil rights statute, this is
I'm
hard.
so glad you said that because a lot of people in my comments who are arguing that everything will be fine if we lose the Department of Education or even if we lose enforcement of IDEA, they say, well, the states handled it before that. But when we had law before that was like EHA and it the reason we have the Department of Education is because they weren't doing it. Oh, it's maddening.
It is maddening. And
Yeah.
and again, because these are kind of political machinations at the risk of our kids, right? Like who bears the price here, right? Who bears the burden? And it's gonna be kids and families, right?
These are things that are also very bipartisan in a lot of cases. Like the attacks on the TRIO program, for example, I'm like, nobody has had any issue with the TRIO program. Why
Yeah.
are you encroaching on it? And, special education, disability does not discriminate, doesn't care what political party you're a
And
part
that's
of.
why we've had bipartisan success in IDA, right? Because disability doesn't know, political affiliation, right? So that's
So,
exactly
yes,
right.
I think there's parents that sometimes are like, "Well, I don't wanna talk about politics or I don't wanna wade into that." But inherently, I don't feel it's political. We
Yeah.
need to be protecting our kids.
We need to be protecting our kids. That's how we get things done, right? Moms, are the key here. Moms are the key here. We got to do everything we can to make it easier to get services and supports, not harder. And that's literally what is happening over the past few months, firing staff, canceling grants, transferring programs, right? These are all tools, right, to ultimately achieve a political at the expense of our kids.
Yes, and I wish we were having the conversation of like, "Hey, let's get IDEA fully funded over
Let's have
14%."
that
You
conversation,
know?
right? I'd love to have that conversation. That's exactly right. Right.
Someday.
Because, that's an important point, Ariel, too, right? Like everything isn't great currently, right? Like there are struggles. We have a lot of ways to improve and do things better. One of those is by investing in education, investing in our teachers, right? There's a lot of things we can do to make things better, but where are our priorities?
Trump compares us to like other countries. He's comparing us to China. He's comparing us to Sweden or Denmark or whatever it was. And I'm like, okay, dude, if you look at those education systems, don't mention China, who has literally like a national curriculum that we don't have. The Department of Education can't set curriculum. So
That's
why are you
right.
even bringing that up? And
That's
then
right.
somewhere like Sweden or Denmark, where they invest in healthcare, they invest in the population's wellness further than education. It's like,
And they compensate teachers and treat them as professionals.
yeah, and they all have unions, and he's over in every state that's really at the top of their game has a very strong teachers union, but he's in the same breath, he's like, yeah, let's get rid of all the teachers unions. It's just, why are we not doing anything that works? And then it's just in favor of pushing political agenda. It's drives me crazy.
Too. Me too.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thanks for keeping this in front of everybody because that's what we got to do.
Totally.